You step through the arch into the cloister walk and the sound changes. Not the silence you expected. Something with texture and weight. Your footsteps come back to you fractionally delayed, a ghost step that follows yours across the stone. A single spoken word carries to the far corner before it dissolves. You are inside an enclosure with specific acoustic properties. Most people attribute this to the age of the stone, to the peculiarity of old buildings, to something they cannot name. That is the explanation that has been available for 8 centuries. It is not what the physical evidence shows. Why does every major medieval monastery cloister built across England, France, and Germany before the 13th century maintain internal dimensions falling within a specific proportional range? The precise range that produces a measurable resonant frequency in enclosed stone spaces. And why does every document recording the systematic dismantling of those monasteries between 1536 and 1792 survive in complete administrative detail, while no surviving document explains why the cloisters were built to the specific dimensions that produce those conditions? The evidence fields are 3: acoustic measurement of surviving monastic spaces, architectural analysis of construction dimensions across hundreds of independent sites, and the documented sequence of demolition during the dissolution. Each field produces the same anomaly. The acoustic conditions inside these spaces match modern conditions for sound-based therapeutic and neurological practice. The record of their systematic demolition is comprehensive. The rationale for why they were built to produce those conditions does not exist in any document. That is the conflict. That is what this video addresses. If you enjoy these stories, then support the channel by liking and subscribing. Thank you. Bernard of Clairvaux spent the 1130s and 1140s designing monasteries across Europe. His letters survive, his treatises survive. What he wrote about the purpose of the cloister walk is not what the official account says a cloister was for. That description has been sitting in the archive for 9 centuries. The accepted explanation is straightforward. Monasteries built for religious withdrawal. Communities of men and women removing themselves from the world to pursue contemplative life. The cloister garth at the center of the plan as a protected garden, an enclosed ambulatory for walking meditation, the daily schedule of canonical hours structuring time around prayer and work, the stone walls providing physical separation from the secular world, the architecture expressing withdrawal, enclosure, the turn inward. This is what has been taught in architectural histories and religious studies for 2 centuries. It is coherent. It is internally consistent. Hundreds of surviving monasteries across Europe have been analyzed within this framework without fundamental revision. But the specific dimensions of the cloister, its width, its vault height, the proportional relationship between its covered walkway and its open garth, are not explained by the theology of withdrawal. A cloister of any dimension would serve the function of an enclosed ambulatory. The dimensions chosen are not the minimum functional dimensions. They are specific, they are consistent, and they produce a particular acoustic result. Canterbury Cathedral Priory's cloister measures 39 meters on its longest side. Westminster Abbey's cloister measures 43 meters. Glastonbury's cloister measured approximately 40 meters before its dissolution. Rievaulx, Fountains, and Tintern, the 3 largest Cistercian monasteries in England, all show cloister dimensions within a range that clusters around 38 to 44 meters. There is no surviving document specifying that a cloister should fall within these dimensions. Note the Cistercian order's architectural statutes, which are among the most detailed architectural regulations to survive from the medieval period, address proportions, ornament, and construction materials at length. They do not specify cloister garth dimensions. The consistency exists in the stone, not in the records. In an enclosed rectangular space of those dimensions, lined with stone walls and covered by vaulted arcades, sound behaves in a specific way. Reflected sound from opposing walls creates standing waves at specific frequencies. At 38 to 44 meters, the primary standing wave frequency falls in the low register, the same low frequency range that acoustic studies of enclosed stone spaces have consistently identified as producing measurable physiological response. These are not assertions. They are predictable outcomes of enclosed rectangular acoustics. But here is where it stops being about architecture. The chapter house attached to every Benedictine and Cistercian monastery was the administrative and deliberative space, where the community assembled daily to hear readings, discuss decisions, and conduct discipline. Chapter houses built before the 13th century are predominantly rectangular or polygonal. The polygonal chapter house, as at Westminster, Salisbury, and Worcester, produces a specific acoustic effect. In a regular polygon lined with stone walls, each wall acts as a reflector, returning sound toward the center. A voice speaking from a single point in a polygonal chapter house is redistributed evenly across the assembled community without amplification. No elevated pulpit, no raised platform above shoulder height. The geometry does the work. The community hears equally from a single spoken source. This required additional construction complexity versus a simple rectangle. It was the harder option to build. The polygonal plan was chosen. The acoustic result of that choice is documented, measurable, and reproducible in surviving examples. The architectural rationale for choosing it, other than acoustic function, is absent from the surviving records. Now look at this carefully, because the next detail is the part most people walk past. The monastic refectory, the dining hall, included in virtually every major surviving Benedictine and Cistercian example, a raised reader's niche built into the long wall. A monk read aloud during meals. The niche is positioned and dimensioned so that a single unamplified voice carries the full length of the hall. Architectural surveys of surviving refectory niches show consistent placement at approximately 1/3 of the hall's length from the entrance, the acoustic node point in a rectangular hall where longitudinal resonance is strongest. The community ate in silence and heard a single voice projected by stone geometry to every seat. The theological explanation is Lectio Divinae, sacred reading during meals. The physical explanation is that the building was acoustically designed so that the reading could be heard without effort. Both are true. Only one is in the records. Bernard of Clairvaux was a Cistercian abbot whose architectural directives governed the design of hundreds of monasteries built across Europe between the 1130s and 1150s. He wrote extensively. His letters survive. His treatises survive. His Apologia, written in 1125, addresses monastic architecture directly. He describes what the cloister should produce in the monk who walks it, not aesthetically, not symbolically, but in terms of interior state. He uses the word ruminatio, a specific Latin term for the meditative practice of walking while murmuring scripture aloud, the sound of the text forming in the mouth and resonating against the stone arcade above. The word means chewing. The acoustic space of the cloister was designed for a practice in which the body produced sound and the stone returned it. The walking, the murmuring, and the dimension of the enclosure were a single system. Bernard described what the practice produced, a state of sustained attention in which thought, sound, and movement became continuous. That is a description of a specific neurological state. He was conscious the space was producing it. He designed the spaces to produce it. Here is the part which will change how you look at every monastery you've ever seen. The abbey church attached to each monastery shares its acoustic profile with the Gothic cathedrals built across the same period. Vault height, stone density, and proportional geometry produce a resonant frequency at approximately 110 Hz in enclosed limestone nave spaces. Neuroscientists at UCLA measured this effect in 2008. At 110 Hz, activity in the brain's language center measurably decreases, while right hemisphere activity increases. The hemisphere associated with spatial awareness, emotional processing, and the dissolution of the boundary between self and environment. The Gregorian chant performed in those naves was composed in the frequency range of the male voice that most strongly activates that resonance. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, structured the monastic day as 8 acoustic events distributed across 8 acoustically differentiated spaces. The cloister walk for private murmured ruminatio, the chapter house for spoken assembly, the nave for formal chant. Each space produced a different acoustic environment. Each acoustic environment corresponded to a different mode of attention. The day was not a schedule of activities. It was a sequence of acoustic states, each occurring in a space calibrated to produce it. The entire monastery was a single instrument played across 24 hours. If you've made it this far, you now know more than 99% of people, But the deeper pattern only becomes visible when you set the acoustic evidence alongside what happened to these spaces. Three separate bodies of evidence: the consistent cloister dimensions, the acoustic profiles of chapter houses and refectories, and the canonical hours as a structured acoustic sequence, all arrive at the same conclusion. These spaces were calibrated to produce specific physiological and neurological states in the people using them. The official theological account of monastic architecture contains none of this. It explains withdrawal, enclosure, separation from the world. It does not explain why the cloister dimensions were consistent to within a narrow range across hundreds of independent construction projects in 3 countries over 3 centuries. It does not explain why the chapter house was polygonal when a rectangle would serve equally well for assembly. It does not explain why the refectory niche was positioned at the acoustic node rather than at the visual center of the long wall. The theological account is internally consistent. The physical account is missing. Those two things cannot both be complete. Here is the part which should genuinely stop you. Henry VIII began the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536. By 1541, over 800 religious houses had been suppressed. The administrative records of the dissolution are among the most complete official documents to survive from the Tudor period. Commissioners visited each house and produced inventories. Each document records the house's name, its income, the names of its inhabitants, the date of suppression, the value of its movable goods. Lead was the first thing stripped. Lead roofing, lead guttering, lead on the vaults. At Rievaulx, the removal of lead from the crossing tower caused the stone vaulting to collapse within months of the suppression. At Fountains, the vault over the nave was gone within a decade. At Tintern, the complete collapse of the interior vaulting followed the lead removal within 2 decades. This sequence repeats across every major English Cistercian house. The administrative record documents the lead removal. The lead removal collapsed the vaults. The vaults were the primary acoustic elements of the space. Here is what should genuinely trouble you about those demolition records. The dissolution commissioners recorded the lead value to the pound. They recorded the number of monks, the contents of the library, the disposition of the altar plate. They recorded whether the abbot had surrendered willingly. They recorded everything with monetary or administrative value. They did not record the acoustic properties of the chapter house. They did not record the resonant frequency of the nave. They did not record the function of the refectory niche. These things had no monetary value in 1536. The commissioners did not see a system. They saw structures, goods, and income. The system they were dismantling was invisible to them because it operated in a register they were not looking at. The vaults came down because they were a source of lead. The specific acoustic conditions they produced were not mentioned in the demolition records because they were not known to the men doing the demolition. They ended a system using an administrative logic that had no category for what the system did. And here is what should trouble you about what happened next. This pattern is not confined to England. In France, the revolutionary suppression of 1789 to 1792 reached the monasteries of Cluny, Citeaux, and Clairvaux. The sequence of demolition followed the same logic. Lead stripped, vaults collapsed, stone sold for building material. The Abbey of Cluny, once the largest church in Christendom, was reduced to a single remaining tower within 30 years of suppression. In Germany, the secularization of 1803 suppressed over 300 religious houses in a single year. The specific record of what was acoustically present in those spaces before suppression does not exist in any of the abolition documents, not because surveyors failed to record it, but because the category of acoustic function in built space was not a recognized administrative category in 1792 or 1803. 3 countries, 3 separate suppression events across 3 centuries, the same demolition sequence, the same absence in the record. Stay with me here, because this last piece is the one that doesn't resolve. The knowledge of why these spaces worked was transmitted within monastic communities through daily practice. A novice monk learning the canonical hours learned the sequence of spaces and sounds together. The knowledge was not architectural theory. It was embodied practice, lived knowledge, transmitted through repetition, the held in the body rather than in any document. The cloister dimensions were not written in any master mason specifications as proportions that produce a standing wave at a specific frequency. They were transmitted as proportional ratios passed within lodge structures through physical demonstration. The knowledge did not need to be written because it was lived every day. When the communities were dissolved and the buildings converted or demolished, the knowledge dissolved with them, not through suppression, through the dissolution of the community that held it in practice. This is not an argument that medieval monks were running acoustic therapy chambers while telling novices it was prayer. What the evidence shows is narrower than that, and harder to dismiss. Monastic spaces were built to specific dimensions that produced specific acoustic conditions. Those conditions had measurable effects on the physiological and neurological state of the people who spent their days inside them. The record of their systematic demolition survives in precise administrative detail. The record of why they were built to those specifications does not exist in any written source, not because it was suppressed or destroyed, but because it was never written. The sequence has a shape. Bernard of Clairvaux died in 1153. He had spent his adult life inside the spaces he helped design, walking the cloister walk in the hours before dawn, murmuring the text of the Psalms against the stone arcade above him, measuring his steps to the rhythm of the words. He used the word ruminatio. He was describing a practice in which sound, movement, and dimension were a single continuous thing. He did not write the acoustic specifications of the cloister he built at Clairvaux. He did not need to. The knowledge was in the practice. He carried it in his body, the way you carry a skill that has never been put into words. His successors carried it. When the house is dissolved, it ended. The cloisters are still there. Some are open to visitors. Stone arcades. Open garth. The particular quality of enclosed air in early morning. The vaults are gone or altered. The lead is gone. The acoustic signature of these spaces as they were built has been permanently modified by the demolitions of 1536, by subsequent repairs, by ventilation systems, and interpretation boards. You can walk the cloister walk at Rivaux. You cannot walk what it was. The lead inventories are in the archive. The commissioners' names are legible. Bernard's letters are in the archive. He wrote about ruminatio, about what the space produced in the monk who used it. He did not write down why the dimensions worked. The demolition orders are complete. The design rationale is not.